5 years ago, Russ asked me to speak on his behalf when this day came. I said yes, but with one condition. And the condition was that he and I meet periodically and talk about life, more particularly his life. And for the last 5 years, that's what we did. At the beginning of our meetings, I had no idea what I was about to discover. I had recently read a book, Tuesdays with Maury. Some of you perhaps know the book. For those of you who don't, a writer visits an elderly man named Maury once a week, once a month for a while to talk about life. And the writer quickly discovers that he's become Maury's student. Well, when I started meeting with Russ, I realized I'm living out this book. Russ is Maury. Girls, your dad taught me much. Well, that day has finally come, and I will now do as he asked. At the request of his family, I'll be the only one speaking today. On our first meeting, Russ gave me a copy of his obituary, which he had written. And he told me that it was to be published in the Hartford Courant as it was written. Well, on this last Tuesday, that was done. But what Russ wrote was more than an obituary. It was a message from him to all of us. I read it to you. Good morning to all my friends and relatives. I guess this will be the last time my name will appear in my favorite newspaper. I was born on February 7th, 1929, to my parents, Ann and Harry Stickles. They were great parents and two of my best friends. My brother Harry passed on some time ago. Harry and I worked together in the automobile field. I guess we'll be together again soon. One of the greatest accomplishments of my life was marrying my wife Peggy, one of the most loving people anyone could ask for. Why in the world she picked me to spend 60 years with amazes me. The next great accomplishment was my 3 girls. All 3 are different, and I love them dearly. Oh, some advice to you folks that are in my age bracket. If your kids ask you to live with them, do it. I lived with Karen and her husband Pat, and it has been a really great experience. Peggy and I were lucky. As far as working is concerned, I did things as the song by my favorite singer, Old Blue Eyes, suggests. I did it my way. I had 8 years of military duty and over 20 years as deputy sheriff in the Hartford court system and retired as a captain. I worked for 3 high sheriffs. My favorite was Sheriff Patrick Hogan, a great guy. After the sheriff's department, I got lucky and went to work for the Public Defender's Division as an investigator. The Public Defender's Office is the best state-run division in Connecticut. You should all take an interest in how your tax dollars are being spent. Well, I guess that about winds things up. On January 4th, 5th now, I'll be at the Cromwell Funeral Home, which is just up the street from my home where I lived for 50 years. I'd like to say one more thing in closing. I've had a great life, and I'm looking forward to the next chapter. Remember the following, and your life will be one that everyone can understand and enjoy. Russ quoted someone. Open quote. I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me shall never die. A really big man said that. Believe it. See you at the next post. Russ Stickles. Also on that first meeting, Russ told me about the time his parents sent him to the Sunday school at the Rock Hill Congregational Church. He said, Chick, I had lots of questions which they just couldn't answer. So I stopped going to Sunday school and just went to church with my parents. He then told me that he took one thing away from those years. Behind the pulpit at the Rock Hill Congregational Church, there's a verse of Scripture written on the wall. I think it's still there. The verse is from the book of John, chapter 11. It reads, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever liveth and believeth in me shall never die. Shortly after Jesus spoke those words, he raised Lazarus from the dead. In those two short lines, a world which until then had been unseen was revealed. It ushered in not only a new way of thinking about death, but of life as well. When Rush finished quoting that to me, he said, Chick, I believe that. That's what I took away from those years. He then added, if that's true, and I believe it is, how can there be any fear of death? Those we leave behind will miss us, may shed tears, but not for me. I replied, Russ, I believe that too. And that's how we began 5 years of conversations. Somewhere in that process, I made a discovery. Oh, not really a discovery. More, I came to have to accept something as fact that I'd always kind of sort of known, and it was this. It is actions that reveal a person's nature. Our words come and go, but our actions reveal the cut and cloth from which we are made. Sadly, we don't always get to see the best of what our fellows do. We see the worst all too easily, but the best is often veiled. It needs to be looked for to be discovered. As I listened to Russ talking about the times of his life, I realized I was hearing more than stories. I was getting a glimpse into the nature, the heart of the man who was sitting before me. I was discovering the man who was sitting before me. Patty, when you were ill with cancer, your dad got really angry with God. So much so that when the assistant minister from the Rocky Hill Church came to visit him, he poured out his anger on him. Russ told me, I asked him, where's your God now? And telling me that, Russ then said to me, Chick, I had no business asking that. And then I told him to make it worse, don't you preach to me. And then Russ added to me, but Chick, I needed that more than I knew. He then answered his own question in both word and deed. Patty, your illness became a catalyst for a change in your dad's very nature. It filled him with a new understanding of not only the world in which he lived, but also the grit that filled his youngest child. He told me, with no small amount of pride, how the Cancer Society had given you a wig when you lost your hair, and then as the two of you were riding somewhere in the car, you threw that damn thing out the window. Close quote. Patty, he beamed at me when he told that story. He then said, after Patty's terrible illness, I began to tell the guys in prison, I'm not God. I'm not to decide guilt and innocence. My job is care and custody. My job is to take care of you. Out of that experience, Russ gained a kind of compassion that is rare for those that work in the criminal justice system. Consider these words spoken by Christ. You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Russ put those words into such practice, to such a degree, that the following newspaper column appeared about him in 1988. I read from that column that was entitled, Sheriff Gives and Gets Respect. I believe this was in the Hartford Courant. A man in a crisp navy sport jacket walked into a courtroom in Part A of the Hartford Superior Court. Smiles, discreet waves, and nods from the people sitting in the courtroom welcomed him. As the man walked to the front of the courtroom where the deputy sheriffs were stationed, Superior Court Judge Salvatore Arena was hearing a case. Arena, with the defendant and attorney standing before him, grinned and reached across the bench with his hand. "Nice to see you, Mr. Stickles," he said. Special Deputy Russ Stickles smiled, shook the judge's hand, and then sat down with the sheriff stationed behind the witness box. After the judge called recess, court personnel and courthouse regulars flocked to greet Stickles, who had just returned from an absence of several months due to an illness of his own. A newspaper reporter who covers that court on a daily basis called Stickles, quote, "the only Connecticut law enforcement officer who is well liked at Summers," Connecticut's maximum security prison. Stickles is in charge of the deputy sheriffs who work on the third floor in Part A of the criminal court. He maintains the delicate balance of keeping the courtrooms under control while treating with respect those for whom many would feel contempt. He jokes with people, enduring the interminable wait that is part of due process, and often leaves them smiling and with a new supply of patience. Yet, in spite of his casual demeanor, he clearly tolerates no trouble. Welcome back, Russ. We missed you. In addition to speaking about Russ also asked me to speak for him. And he gave me several personal messages to be delivered here today. Debbie, always remember the Pookie Indians. You know what I'm talking about. Also, don't always try to be in charge. Sometimes you just can't. Debbie, I love you. Karen, thank you for taking care of Mom and me. Also, you know the meaning of friendship. By the way, you were not adopted, no matter what your sisters tell you. Patty, you're my animal lover. It doesn't matter what kind they are. You almost broke me with horses. And I love you too. Patsy, you're a good guy. The world should have more guys like you. And then he said to me afterwards, Patsy said, "Chick, I love the kid." Lily, you taught me that I was not smarter than the rest of the world. And you did more for me than my doctors. Then last week, while I was visiting him in the hospital for the last time, he added this. He said, "Lily, look in the mirror every day, and what looks back at you is success. You really can do whatever you'd like to." Debbie, Karen, and Patty, there was something that troubled your dad greatly because it hurt him to see it happen, and it saddened him that there was nothing he could do to help. This bothered him so much that a week ago during my last visit with him, when I asked him if there was anything more that he wanted to add, he gave me this. "For the three of you," he said, "I'd like to see the three of you love each other as sisters should." And those were the last words he asked me to write down. I now offer a prayer for Russ and for each of us. You know it well. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And now, Russ, in fact, does dwell in the house of the Lord, where he shall remain forever. It is important for us who still live to resist being fooled by the apparent importance of the immediate. It is good for us to remember that the ever-presence of eternity looms over all of us. And it was that understanding that lied beneath the peace that Russ enjoyed. Russ did not fear death because he understood it was the gateway to a new world, a world made for us from before the beginning of time. It is a place where those that have gone before us now reside, and it is the place where Russ now lives. What is that place? Sometimes we refer to it as heaven, sometimes as the new heaven and earth. We call it these things because of the promises made to all of mankind by God himself while he resided among us in the person of the man that we call Jesus, who was in fact the Christ. We're going to conclude with a story that Russ asked me to read to you today. Falling leaves. A gust of wind that tore it from the tree separated the brightly colored leaf from its fellows, who were also spinning to the ground. The boy, who had been studying the blue autumn sky, was dreaming of things and places far away. But when that leaf drifted from the others, it ceased to be a leaf. Running to get beneath it in the same way his father had taught him to line up a fly ball, he waited until it gently fell into his hands. He had done it. He had saved this leaf from touching the ground. A few months later, on Christmas morning, the boy stood before his father, grinning in the way that boys who have done something good often do. His father waited for the boy to speak. "Dad, when does a leaf die?" The father replied, "You have to tell me a little more. I don't know what you mean." "Well, does a leaf die when it breaks free from the tree, or does it die when it hits the ground?" The boy's thinking took the father by surprise, and it also made him cautious. "I've never considered that before," he said. "Why do you ask?" "This fall, while I was watching the leaves change color, it made me wonder. When a leaf is torn from the tree, it's still beautiful, and I wondered if it might still be alive." The boy paused as a troubled look clouded his face. A new thought had suddenly complicated his thinking. He then said, "Of course, some leaves, like the oaks, never do turn color. They just hang on and turn brown." Sensing the boy had come upon an idea he was not yet ready for, his father broke the train of thought by asking, "What do you have behind your back?" Beaming, the boy revealed a roughly wrapped package, and as he held it out, he said, "I think that leaves don't die until they touch the ground. This is for you. Merry Christmas." When his father opened the package, he found a picture frame which contained, pressed beneath its glass, a single brightly colored leaf. Beneath the leaf were words written in the unsteady hand of a 10-year-old. It read, "I caught this leaf before it touched the ground," which means it's still alive. "Daddy, please don't ever touch the ground." Decades later, the frame containing the still living leaf hung in the father's office, and as the aged man sat looking at the leaf, he recalled his son's words. Of course, some leaves, like the oaks, never do turn color. They just hang on and turn brown. Then, sitting back in his chair, he considered, it's during the green that we gain the faith to blaze as we should, and then fall exhausted, but still alive, into the waiting hands of a loving God. He hoped the boy had the same thought. As we leave here today, let us allow the hard thing of Russ's passing to be the catalyst of some good thing that might arise in each of us. I can think of no better way to honor your father, who was a wonderfully uncommon man. Amen. On behalf of Karen and Debbie and Patty, I want to thank you all for coming.